The command post fell silent at 3:47 hours, not because of protocol, but because every eye had locked onto the same thermal display. Something was cutting through the Hindu Kush at terrain-hugging altitude, moving with the kind of precision that separated veterans from corpses. The aircraft wasn't squawking friendly. It wasn't squawking anything. Just a heat signature and a flight path that suggested either suicidal intent or skills that belonged in a museum. Major Davinsky reached for the radio, then stopped. His hand hovered over the transmit button because the radar operator, a kid barely 3 months in country, had gone pale. The signature had just threaded between two peaks with a margin measured in feet, not yards. Nobody flew like that. Nobody living. The operation had been compromised 6 hours earlier when a supply convoy took fire near the Pakistani border. 3 vehicles burning. 17 soldiers pinned down in a dried riverbed with Taliban fighters occupying the high ground on 3 sides. Apache had tried twice. The mountain winds at that altitude made their rotors scream, and the enemy had learned to wait until the birds committed before lighting them up with RPGs. One Apache had limped back to base with hydraulic fluid painting its tail boom red. The other never made the second pass. Now 20 souls were counting down their ammunition in the dark, while colonels argued about acceptable losses and risk assessment matrices. The kind of math that translated to body bags by sunrise. That's when the unknown contact appeared. No flight plan, no authorization, no call sign transmitted, just that heat signature doing things that violated every safety regulation written in blood over 50 years of military aviation. The Taliban had no aircraft. The Pakistanis weren't supposed to be operating in this sector. Which left exactly one possibility that nobody wanted to say aloud because it meant someone had gone rogue. And rogue in a combat zone usually meant either heroic or catastrophically stupid, with the distinction only clear after counting the dead. Davinsky finally keyed the mic. "Unknown aircraft, this is Bagram Command. Identify immediately or you will be engaged." The radio crackled with static and mountain interference. Then a voice came through, calm as Sunday morning with an accent that suggested Oklahoma or maybe Arkansas. "Bagram, this is Reaper 7. I'm already engaged." The transmission cut before anyone could respond. On the thermal display, the aircraft had dropped even lower, now tracking the riverbed where the convoy sat dying. The radar operator looked up at Davinsky with a question he couldn't articulate. The major just shook his head. They were about to watch someone either save 17 lives or add themselves to the casualty count. The only certainty was that in 90 seconds, everyone in that command post would know which kind of pilot flew without permission into a kill box at midnight. 300 miles south, in a maintenance hangar that smelled of hydraulic fluid and defeat, Master Sergeant Kowalski was discovering that someone had stolen an A-10 Thunderbolt. Not borrowed, not requisitioned, stolen. The aircraft had been designated for parts reclamation, its turbofans scheduled for overhaul, its airframe logged as non-mission capable. Yet the tie-down chains lay cut on the tarmac, and the maintenance logs showed a departure time that coincided with shift change, when nobody watched the boneyard too carefully. Kowalski ran a hand over the empty hardstand and found himself grinning despite the paperwork nightmare this represented. Someone had pre-flighted a warthog in the dark, filed no flight plan, and pointed it toward the most contested airspace in Afghanistan. That took either desperation or the kind of certainty that came from having nothing left to lose. He pulled out his radio to report the theft, then paused. The logs showed weapons loaded. Whoever took that bird wasn't joyriding. They were hunting. The Taliban fighters on the ridgeline didn't hear the aircraft until it was too late. The A-10 had dropped below their sight line, using the terrain like a predator uses tall grass, invisible until the moment of attack. The first indication came not from sound but from light, a string of tracers that painted the darkness in shades of orange and white as the GAU-8 Avenger cannon opened up. The gun didn't sound like other aircraft weapons. It sounded like industrial machinery chewing through metal, a deep mechanical roar that lasted 3 seconds and erased everything in its path. The fighters who had been raining fire on the convoy disintegrated into the kind of silence that follows absolute violence. Then the aircraft pulled up, barely clearing the opposite ridge, and the soldiers in the riverbed saw it for the first time. Stubby wings, twin engines mounted high. The unmistakable profile of the Thunderbolt, painted in the flat gray that turned it into a ghost against the pre-dawn sky. Someone in the convoy keyed their radio. What the fuck was that? Nobody answered because nobody knew. In the command post, Davinsky was trying to raise the pilot again. Reaper 7, authenticate. Give me a call sign verification and your authorization code. The response came back after a long pause, and this time there was something different in the voice. Not defiance exactly, more like resignation. Sir, if I give you my name, you'll order me back. Those soldiers don't have the time for that conversation. Davinsky felt his jaw tight. Captain, I need your identification right now. Another pause. Then Captain Marlowe, service number 7732948. I'll answer for this when they're safe. The transmission ended. Someone in the command post whistled low. Davinsky closed his eyes. He knew that name. Everyone who'd been in country more than 6 months knew that name. Captain Iris Marlowe, widow, mother of one. The pilot they'd grounded 3 weeks ago for pushing back against a colonel who thought tactics were less important than his flight time statistics. The woman who'd flown 73 combat missions before someone decided her childcare situation made her a liability. The Taliban regrouped faster than expected. The A-10 had eliminated the primary position, but secondary fighters emerged from caves on the northern ridge, dragging heavy machine guns into position. They'd learned from the first pass. This time they were ready, tracking vectors, understanding that the Warthog would have to come back through the same corridor if it wanted another run at them. The aircraft's fuel was finite. Its ammunition was finite. The pilot's nerve would break or hold, and they'd bet everything on break. They'd seen confident pilots before. They'd shot down confident pilots before. This would be no different. The gunners settled into firing positions and waited. The sky was beginning to gray with the promise of dawn. The darkness that had protected the A-10 was burning away with every passing minute. Soon they'd see it coming. Soon they'd tear it apart. Marlowe knew the tactical situation had shifted. She could feel it in the way the radio chatter changed, in the sudden absence of fire from the northern ridge. They were setting a trap. Classic ambush doctrine. Let the target commit, then engage from multiple angles simultaneously. She taught this exact scenario at Nelly's Air Force Base before her husband died and her life collapsed into a series of impossible choices between duty and motherhood. The brass had eventually made the choice for her, grounding her after she missed a briefing to deal with her daughter's emergency room visit. They'd called it a pattern of unreliability. She'd called it being a single parent in a system designed for people who could ignore their children's existence. Now she was 5,000 feet above soldiers who were about to die because protocol mattered more than results. The A-10 shuddered as she pushed it into a banking turn. Her daughter's foe was taped to the instrument panel. 6 years old, gap-toothed smile, no father, might soon be no mother either. Marlowe keyed the radio one more time. Convoy, mark your position with strobes, I'm coming back through. The second pass was where pilots either became legends or statistics. Marlowe brought the A-10 in from a different angle, using a dried tributary that the Taliban hadn't bothered to cover. The sun was cresting the eastern peaks now, painting the mountains in shades of amber and blood. She could see the muzzle flashes before they found her, see the tracers reaching up like accusing fingers. The Warthog was built to take punishment. Titanium bathtub protecting the cockpit. Redundant systems. The Air Force called it survivable. Marlowe called it a flying tank that handled like one. She lined up the shot, felt the aircraft buck as the GAU-8 spun up, and walked the rounds across the northern ridge like a conductor directing an orchestra of destruction. The cannon shells, each the size of a Coke bottle, carved the mountain face into rubble and memory. The Taliban position ceased to exist in practical terms. The survivors scattered into the deep caves where aircraft couldn't follow. The immediate threat was neutralized. But the A-10 was bleeding now. Something had clipped the right engine during the pass. Not catastrophic, but enough to throw off the turbine balance, enough to fill the cockpit with the smell of burning metal and the high-pitched whine of damaged components. Marlowe ran through the emergency checklist from memory while simultaneously scanning for threats. The convoy below was moving, soldiers sprinting to the vehicles, loading wounded, executing the kind of organized chaos that meant professional training and the desperate motivation of people who'd just been given an unexpected chance at living. She climbed to a safer altitude, felt the aircraft shudder again and made a calculation. She could limp back to Bagram, probably, or she could stay on station until those vehicles cleared the kill zone. Definitely couldn't do both. The fuel gauge and the damaged engine made that arithmetic simple and absolute. The convoy commander's voice came through on the emergency frequency. Reaper 7, this is groundside. We're moving. We've got 5 critical casualties, but everyone's aboard. You saved our asses. Marlowe didn't respond immediately. She was watching a dust trail on the eastern approach. More vehicles, moving fast. The Taliban didn't give up easily, especially not when they'd been humiliated by a single aircraft. She toggled to the command frequency. Bagram, Reaper 7. Convoy is mobile, but they've got pursuit inbound from the east. I'm staying. Davinsky's voice came back hard. Negative, Captain. You're ordered to return to base immediately. That's a direct command. Marlowe looked at her daughter's photo again. Thought about what it meant to follow orders when orders were wrong. Thought about 17 families who'd receive folded flags if she left now. Sir, with respect, my radio seems to be malfunctioning. Reaper 7 going off comms. She reached down and switched off the receiver. The sudden silence in her headset felt like freedom or maybe damnation. Hard to tell the difference at altitude. The pursuing vehicles were technical trucks, pickup beds mounted with heavy machine guns and recoilless rifles, fast enough to overtake the damaged convoy, armed enough to shred it once they caught up. Marlowe pushed the damaged A-10 into a shallow dive, lining up an attack vector that would bring her in directly over the road. The right engine was screaming now, temperature gauges climbing into red zones that meant imminent failure. She had maybe one more gun run in her before the aircraft decided whether it wanted to fly or become a very expensive lawn dart. The Warthog's airspeed indicator climbed past prudent limits. The wings were shaking. Everything was shaking. She could see the faces of the men in the technical trucks now, see them pointing skyward, see them understanding too late that the dying aircraft above them was about to become their problem. The GAU-8 spun up for what Marlowe knew would be the last time this morning, maybe the last time ever. The gun run was textbook perfect and completely insane. Marlowe held the trigger down for a full 5-second burst, walking the depleted uranium rounds across all 3 pursuing vehicles in a diagonal line that turned engines into scrap metal and men into ghosts. The recoil from the cannon actually slowed the A-10 in midair, the aircraft shuddering like a dog shaking off water. Then the right engine exploded. Not dramatically. Just a solid thump and a sudden loss of thrust that sent the Warthog into an immediate yaw. Marlowe fought the controls, compensating with the left engine, adjusting trim, doing everything the manual said to do when your aircraft decided it preferred falling over flying. The ground was very close. The mountain peaks were very solid. She pulled back on the stick with both hands and felt the Warthog respond with the grudging cooperation of a machine that was technically still airworthy but deeply resentful about it. The convoy disappeared behind her as she focused entirely on not becoming a smoking crater. Bagram Tower spotted the aircraft 15 miles out, limping in on one engine with enough battle damage to justify a foam runway and emergency cruise. Marlowe came in hot and fast because slow and controlled wasn't an option anymore. The landing was controlled violence, wheels hitting tarmac, brakes screaming, the remaining engine at full reverse thrust. She brought the Warthog to a stop 300 feet from the end of the runway. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft before she'd finished the shutdown checklist. Hands pulled her from the cockpit. Faces swam in her vision. Someone was shouting about court-martial and dereliction. Someone else was shouting about the 17 soldiers now rolling through the front gate in their battered convoy, alive against all probability. Marlowe stood on the tarmac, covered in sweat and hydraulic fluid, and waited for whatever came next. Her daughter's photo was still clutched in her hand. She'd grabbed it from the instrument panel during the landing. Some priorities transcended regulations. The court-martial proceedings began exactly 4 hours after Marlowe landed. The Air Force moved quickly when it wanted to make examples. She sat in a gray room with a detailed attorney who looked fresh out of law school and nervous about defending someone who'd stolen a multi-million-dollar aircraft. The charges were impressive: unauthorized use of military equipment, failure to obey direct orders, reckless endangerment, and about 6 other violations that each carried years in Leavenworth. The attorney kept talking about plea deals and mitigating circumstances. Marlowe wasn't listening. She was thinking about her daughter waiting with a neighbor, wondering why Mommy hadn't called, thinking about the convoy soldiers who were currently being debriefed about why they were alive. The attorney finally stopped talking and looked at her. "Captain, you understand this is serious. They're going to push for prison time." Marlowe met his eyes. "I understand that 17 families still have their soldiers." "That's what I understand." The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following morning, which meant Marlowe spent the night in temporary detention. Not quite the brig, but definitely not freedom. She lay on a narrow bunk and stared at the ceiling while the administrative machinery of military justice ground through its procedures. Nobody came to visit. Nobody was allowed to. She was radioactive now, the kind of problem that made careers implode for anyone who expressed support. Even the soldiers she'd saved couldn't speak up without jeopardizing their own standing. The system had rules about gratitude. It had rules about everything. Around midnight she heard voices outside her door. Low, intense conversation. She couldn't make out words, just tone. Someone was arguing, someone else was refusing. Then silence. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep and failed completely. The photo of her daughter was in an evidence bag somewhere, tagged and cataloged like every other piece of her life that was about to be dismantled. Dawn brought Major Davinsky. He entered her cell without ceremony, dismissed the guard, and sat down heavily on the one chair. He looked older than yesterday, like he'd aged years in the hours since her landing. "You know you're fucked," he said without preamble. Marlowe nodded. "I figured." Davinsky ran a hand over his face. "The convoy commander tried to submit a commendation. They wouldn't accept it, said you can't be commended for actions taken while violating direct orders." He paused. "7 of those soldiers you saved were going to be fathers in the next 3 months. 4 others had kids at home. The rest were someone's child. I thought you should know." Marlowe felt something crack in her chest. "Doesn't change the regulations I violated." Davinsky stood up, walked to the small window that showed the flight line. "No, it doesn't, but maybe regulations aren't always the point." He left without saying anything else. The guard returned. The machinery continued its grinding. The hearing room filled with brass and witnesses and the kind of military decorum that made rebellion feel impossible. Marlowe stood at attention while charges were read. Each violation was detailed with the precision of people who'd spent their careers perfecting the art of condemnation. The stolen aircraft, the ignored orders, the unauthorized combat action. Her attorney made motions that were overruled. The prosecutor, a colonel with ribbons suggesting extensive combat experience, presented evidence with the enthusiasm of someone building a monument to regulatory compliance. It was methodical, professional, devastating. Marlowe watched her career disintegrate in real time, converted into legal language and procedural documentation. Then the convoy commander entered the room. He wasn't supposed to be there. Witnesses would be called later. But he walked in anyway, still wearing his combat uniform, still carrying the dust of Afghanistan on his boots. The judge looked up, annoyed. "Sergeant, you're out of order." The convoy commander stood at attention. "Sir, with respect, so is this entire proceeding." The room went silent. "I'm Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb," he continued, voice steady and loud enough to fill the space. "3 tour, 18 years in, 2 bronze stars and a Purple Heart. I'm the man Captain Marlowe saved 4 days ago along with 16 others. I'm also the man who's going to make this difficult." He produced a folder, thick with paper. "These are statements from every soldier in that convoy, every single one. They all say the same thing. Captain Marlowe violated regulations to do what the regulations were supposed to accomplish, protect American lives. You want to court-martial her, fine, but you'll do it knowing that everyone she saved thinks this proceeding is bullshit." The prosecutor stood. "Sergeant, you're in contempt," Webb cut him off. "I'm in clarity, sir, which is more than I can say for this room." He dropped the folder on the defense table and turned to leave. "You want to punish competence? Go ahead, but don't pretend it's justice." The hearing adjourned for 3 hours while the command structure figured out how to handle a situation that had suddenly become visible beyond the immediate chain of command. Webb's statement had been recorded by a journalist embedded with the convoy. The story was already filtering through military news networks. A female pilot, a stolen aircraft, 17 saved lives versus career-ending violations. The narrative was too good, too clean, too perfectly constructed for the media age. By noon, civilian news outlets were picking it up. By evening, it was national. The Air Force Public Affairs Office went into damage control mode, trying to shape the story into something less inflammatory. They failed. The public loves underdogs and hates bureaucracy, and Marlowe had become both simultaneously. The command staff who'd been eager to prosecute her that morning suddenly found themselves managing optics instead of regulations. The colonel who'd grounded her 3 weeks ago was quietly reassigned to desk duties pending review of his command decisions. Inside the detention facility, Marlowe was unaware of the external chaos. She'd been isolated from news and communication, standard procedure during legal proceedings. She spent the hours reviewing her own actions, cataloging every decision point where she could have chosen differently. The conclusion was always the same. If she'd followed orders, 17 soldiers would be dead and she'd still have her career. The math suggested she'd made the right choice. The regulations said otherwise. Around sunset, her attorney returned with a legal pad full of notes and an expression suggesting exhausted confusion. "They're dropping most of the charges," he said. "Not all, but most. You'll face administrative discipline, loss of flight status, probably forced resignation, but no prison." Marlowe felt her shoulders sag. "Why?" The attorney shook his head. "Because the alternative became politically untenable. Congratulations, Captain. You're a PR problem instead of a criminal." The final administrative board convened 3 weeks later with far less ceremony than the court-martial would have had. Marlowe sat in dress uniform, while colonels and generals determined her professional fate through the bloodless language of fitness reports and career progression assessments. The conclusion was inevitable but drawn out, delivered with the kind of careful phrasing that made punishment sound like opportunity. She would be honorably discharged. Her flight status would be permanently revoked. She would receive full benefits and recognition for her service record prior to the incident. The incident, that's what they called it. Not heroism, not violation. The incident. Marlowe signed the papers they placed before her and tried to feel something about the end of her military career. Mostly she felt tired. The brass filed out. Her attorney shook her hand. She walked out of the building into afternoon sunlight that felt too bright, too normal for the moment. Her daughter was waiting by the car, holding her grandmother's hand. 6 months later, Marlowe was working as a flight instructor at a civilian aviation school in Nevada. Teaching rich kids and career changers how to handle Cessnas felt like using a surgical scalpel to spread butter, but it paid the bills, and she was home for dinner every night. Her daughter had adjusted better than expected to having a mother who was present instead of deployed. They developed routines, breakfast together, homework at the kitchen table, bedtime stories that didn't involve military operations. It was normal, aggressively normal. Marlowe found she didn't hate it. On clear days, she'd look up and watch contrails cross the sky and feel the phantom weight of a control stick in her hands. The muscle memory of flight didn't fade. Neither did the memory of those 3 minutes over the Hindu Kush when she'd chosen soldiers over safety. Most days she thought she'd made the right choice. Some days she wasn't sure choice had been involved at all. The package arrived on a Tuesday with no return address and military postage. Inside was her daughter's photo, the one from the cockpit instrument panel, and a letter on official Air Force stationery. Marlowe read it twice to make sure she understood correctly. It was from Webb, the convoy commander. His words were simple. 17 of us are alive to argue about whether regulations matter more than results. You gave us that argument. Thank you. Attached was a photograph of the convoy team, posed together at some base somewhere, holding a hand-painted sign that read, "Reaper 7 saved our asses." Marlowe put the letter on her refrigerator next to her daughter's school artwork and permission slips. That evening, she took her daughter to the high desert outside town, and they watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades that reminded Marlowe of that morning in Afghanistan. Her daughter asked if she missed flying. Marlowe thought about it. "I miss having a reason to fly," she said finally, "but I found better reasons to land." Years passed with the steady erosion that turns headlines into footnotes. Marlowe's story occasionally surfaced in military forums and aviation circles, debated by people who hadn't been there and didn't understand the weight of impossible choices. Some called her a hero. Others called her reckless. Most just moved on to newer controversies and fresher scandals. Marlowe taught her classes, raised her daughter, and slowly rebuilt a life that didn't revolve around call signs and combat. She dated occasionally, never seriously, attended parent-teacher conferences and soccer games, learned that peace was harder than war because war had clear objectives, and peace just demanded you keep going without knowing if you were winning. Her daughter grew tall and confident, showing no interest in military service and every interest in veterinary medicine. Marlowe encouraged it. The world needed people who healed things. On the anniversary of that flight, she'd drive out to the desert and watch the sky and remember what it felt like to matter absolutely. The Air Force changed its policies 3 years after Marlowe's discharge. New guidelines for single parents, better support systems, revised protocols for emergency combat situations. The changes came quietly, embedded in administrative updates that few people read and fewer understood. But people who knew the history recognized the fingerprints. Marlowe's incident had exposed fractures in a system that prized order over adaptation. The brass who'd prosecuted her were retired now, replaced by younger officers who'd studied the case in staff college and drawn different conclusions. The A-10 she'd flown had been repaired and returned to service, its tail marked with 17 small stars, one for each saved soldier. The maintenance crews who serviced it called it Marlowe's Warthog, though officially it was just another airframe in the inventory. Stories accumulated around it the way stories accumulate around objects that witness something true. Some said it flew better after the repairs. Some said that was bullshit. Everyone agreed it had character. The reunion happened by accident at a military aviation museum in Arizona. Marlowe had brought her daughter to see the exhibits, teaching her about the aircraft that had shaped her mother's life. They were standing in front of an A-10 display when someone called out her name. She turned to find Webb, older and graying, but still carrying himself with the posture of someone who'd seen combat and survived. Behind him were 4 others from the convoy, gathered for their annual remembrance trip. The recognition was instant and mutual. Webb crossed the distance between them and extended his hand. "Captain," Marlowe shook it. "Sergeant, I'm just Iris now," Webb smiled. "You'll always be Reaper 7 to us." They talked for an hour while their kids and families orbited nearby, talked about what came after, the therapy, the nightmares, the slow process of converting survival into life. The others joined in, sharing pieces of the story from their perspectives, the waiting, the desperation. The sound of that cannon tearing up the ridgeline, how they'd thought they were dead until they weren't. Before they parted, Webb pulled out a small package. "We wanted you to have this. All 17 of us contributed." Inside was a patch custom-made, unauthorized by any official channel. It showed an A-10 silhouetted against a sunrise with the words Reaper 7, regulations are suggestions embroidered beneath. Marlowe laughed despite herself. This is completely against dress code, Webb grinned. Yeah, well, so was saving our lives. She pinned it to her jacket lapel, right where everyone could see it. Her daughter asked what it meant. Marlowe knelt down to her level. It means sometimes the right thing and the allowed thing aren't the same, and when that happens, you have to decide which person you want to be. Her daughter considered this with the seriousness of youth. What kind of person are you? Marlowe looked at Webb and the others, looked at the A-10 behind them. I'm the kind who chooses people over paperwork, every time. The convoy soldiers nodded. 17 times someone had chosen them. They'd never forget, neither would she. The command post at Bagram had been demolished years ago, replaced by newer facilities with better technology and different personnel. But the story persisted in the handoffs between rotating units, told and retold, until it became part of the base mythology. New pilots arriving in-country would hear about Reaper 7 eventually, usually late at night when the stories got honest. They'd hear about the stolen A-10 and the impossible flight and the woman who decided that court-martial was preferable to letting soldiers die. The details would vary with each telling. Some versions made her more heroic, others more reckless, but the core remained constant. One pilot, one aircraft, one choice. The story served different purposes for different people. For some it was inspiration. For others it was warning. For the brass it was a complicated legacy that resisted easy categorization. Good soldiers followed orders. Great soldiers knew when orders were insufficient. Marlowe had been great, and it had cost her everything except the thing that mattered. Davinsky, now a colonel, kept a photograph on his desk. It showed the thermal image from that night, the heat signature of the threading between mountain peaks in the darkness. He'd had it printed and framed, though he never explained it to visitors who asked. To him, it represented the moment when theory met reality and reality won. He'd built his career on discipline and order, believing that military effectiveness came from everyone following the plan. Marlowe had proved him wrong in the most absolute way possible. She'd shown him that plans were just organized guesses, and sometimes the guess was wrong, and someone had to be brave enough or crazy enough to recognize it. He'd supported the court-martial initially because that's what protocol demanded. He'd helped kill the prosecution later because that's what conscience demanded. The photograph was his reminder that both could be true simultaneously. The military needed order. The military needed people willing to break that order when lives were at stake. Reconciling those truths was the work of leadership. He was still working on it. In Nevada, Marlowe's civilian students sometimes noticed the patch on her jacket and asked about it. She'd deflect with vague answers about military service and inside jokes. But occasionally, when a student was struggling with a difficult concept or showing more fear than skill, she'd take them aside and tell them the real story. Not the hero version or the reckless version, but the true version. She'd been terrified. She'd known the consequences. She'd done it anyway because the alternative was unacceptable. The students would listen with the wide-eyed attention of people who'd never faced death and couldn't quite imagine the weight of that choice. Then they'd go back to their training flights and practice emergency procedures with slightly more seriousness. Marlowe watched them and felt the satisfaction of passing something forward. Not glory or fame, but the understanding that competence mattered, that training mattered, that when the moment came you'd better be ready because hesitation killed people. She taught them to fly. She taught them to land. Most importantly, she taught them that the sky didn't care about their fear. It only cared about their decisions. The legacy lived in unexpected places, in policy changes that would prevent future Marlowes from facing impossible choices, in convoy procedures that now included dedicated close air support protocols, in the maintenance logs of an A-10 that flew with 17 stars on its tail. In the bedtime stories, a mother told her daughter about choices and consequences and the complicated math of doing right in wrong situations. Marlowe's discharge papers sat in a file cabinet somewhere, official documentation of failure by military standards. But 17 families had fathers and sons and brothers who came home. That math was simpler, more honest. The kind that survived transitions between duty stations and changes in command, and the slow erosion of institutional memory. Years from now, when everyone involved was retired or dead, some young pilot would hear about Reaper 7 and wonder if the story was true. They'd search the records and find contradictions, official reports versus sworn statements, regulations versus results. The truth would be buried somewhere in the middle, complicated and human and impossible to reduce to simple lessons. But they'd understand one thing clearly. The command post went still that night not because of protocol, but because someone chose courage over compliance. And 17 soldiers lived because of it. Everything else was just paperwork.